Hey there, I'm Ryan, and welcome to today's acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I will have the traceable up over on Patreon. If you're interested, check it out, but with that, let's jump in and have some fun. We're going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush, which I will dip the bottom third of into a little bit of water, then proceed to wipe off the excess. This will just keep our paint wet for a longer period of time. And speaking of paint, here we have a titanium white, Mars black, and an ultramarine blue. We're going to start off in the sky, so we'll grab an abundance of our titanium white. We'll grab a hint of our ultramarine blue. We can slowly work in more as we need it, and we want to desaturate the blue, so we'll also grab the smallest hint of Mars black using the corner of our brush, and we'll take the excess off elsewhere. But we do want an abundance of paint because we have a large sky, and again, we want it to just have a hint of blue. Now, I have quite a few trees drawn in here, and you have two options. One, you can paint around it, as I currently am here, or you can paint over them and then simply redraw them in later. I'm not too worried about going over them, to be honest. It's not a super complicated drawing, and you can always go back to the start of the video and look at where everything was. If you're up over on Patreon, you can also just use the traceable to redraw them on. But when you're working around them, as I am here, it's very imperative that you don't apply a lot of pressure with your brush strokes because you don't want noticeable brush strokes showing through. You don't want all of these essentially vertical lines. So, an easy way of working around that is just to be fairly soft with your brush. It does mean it'll be difficult to pull paint from one area to another, but we really don't want to be pulling paint anyway because we want a nice thick initial application. And the farther you drag paint out, the more thin it becomes. Now, throughout this lesson, as per usual, I will be doing a lot of shots up close so you can see the detail work and the actual brush work, but I'll also be pulling the camera back as we have right now so you can see everything as a cohesive whole. And I think it's important when you paint to do get close to the canvas so you can see your detail work, how you're working with your brushes, but it's also important to take those steps back so that you can ensure that everything is still nice and cohesive. Also, I'm painting over where a lot of foliage is going to be. That way we have more option with where we actually put said foliage. So we'll just grab quite a bit more paint, go back into working in these areas. I am going to end up covering some of these trees, not too worried about it. And because we're working with acrylics, you're probably going to want to do a couple of layers. So wait 3, 4, 5 minutes, let it dry fully, come back in, do a second layer, and then we can proceed on to the next step. Now we're going to start working on the trees in the background, and this is going to be a 3 to 4 layer process. We're starting with the 1-inch flat-headed brush, and we're going to begin by creating a mid-value of green. This is a sap green, yet again, moving to a clean area of our palette. We'll grab about 1/3 of that in our titanium white. We'll grab maybe 1/5 in our Mars black, and we'll desaturate this green, but what we'll also do is make it a bit more thick. Typically, sap green and other more pure hues are quite thin with acrylics, where titanium white and Mars black are a bit more thick. So you don't have to do as many layers, but the predominant reason for doing this really is to end up with more of a desaturated mid-value. You can see how we're slowly taking it from that green to something that has a bit more gray. Very much the goal. So, from there, we'll go in, and much like with the sky, I'm going to work somewhat
around my trees. If I cover them up, that's okay. And it's also worth noting, you would definitely want to overlap your trees a little bit with the paint rather than completely dodging them. Because if you leave an open area where the foliage should be and the tree, then you're going to end up having to expand your trees and make them look potentially larger than they should be, a little bit awkward. So do overlap your trees a little bit, and that's something you can see I'm doing quite frequently. Now I'm also working predominantly with a vertical stroke, just because it's convenient, but in layer number 2 I might go back like that, or give it an X-shaped pattern to give it a bit of a random application. Neither of which are wrong, and we're going to cover this up with a lot of paint, but you do want to consider your brush strokes. And if you press very softly, you probably won't have too many anyway. That said, we're going to continue moving up here, trying to keep my hand out of the line of sight with the camera. Apologies if I do falter here and there with it. Easy to get kind of just drawn into the painting process itself. But with that, you can see that the top is very jagged. There are a lot of different movements in here, and that's actually really what we want. We want something that's unique, but we're going to continue making it unique by grabbing more of that pigment, and then with our brush towards the top, we're going to do a tap and rotate the brush. And this is going to give us the appearance of foliage that's just loosely poking out and coming up. I think I actually want to make this a little bit bigger. By going over it this way with a little bit of detail, we get to ensure that we actually have the coverage that we want. And again, you can see me rotating my brush. That's one of the benefits of using the 1-inch flathead. It's very large, picks up a lot of paint, so you can do your backgrounds with it, but in addition, it's versatile, and we can get some nice detail as well. There we go. Nice and easy. But remember, we are going over this with additional layers, so it doesn't need to be perfect. In fact, we are looking for a very just randomized look with it. Here we are, quite a bit closer. I'm just finishing up layer number 2, and I thought I would show you a close-up shot of how I like to work these edges. Again, sometimes it's a line, and then I'll rotate my brush, rotate it, but then I might also just use the corner of the brush to do a little bit of a tapping motion. Again, very versatile. We can use an edge, we can use the body, we can use just a corner. Doesn't have to be perfect, but it's great practice for later layers because we are going to do more, and we can kind of test ideas here before the colors get a little more complicated. But it's time to let that dry, and we can move on to the next step. For our next step, we'll be switching to a stiff fan brush, and this will be fantastic for very sharp detail. So we're going to use our fan brush, but before we do, we need to mix a little bit of paint. And the fan brush isn't great for that because it doesn't pick up a lot of paint. You don't want to condense your bristles. So we'll continue using this one for just a second, but not actually the painting process. Now, for the next mix, I want a significantly darker green. So I'm going to mix that right under our previous one. That way I can kind of compare and contrast throughout the process. You can also print off the reference photo and test directly on that. That is a practice I do very much enjoy. But here we have a nice dark pigment. So let's get closer to the canvas and use the new brush. Now here, we're going to be integrating shadows into our foliage. So areas where the light can't get through. And with this brush, you can see that I'm not pressing the entirety of it into the canvas, but rather different portions, and I'm rotating very inconsistently. I'm trying to create a lot of a random effect, but we essentially are adding a great deal of these dots, of these markings, that we wouldn't really be able to render any other way. The bristles on the fan brush, on the stiff fan brush specifically, are so sharp and distinct. They stand out from each other, they don't clump. We're also not making this brush damp like we do the 1-inch flat, which is also going to help ensure that it doesn't clump. But this brush is very unique and great because we are getting all of these different markings from individual bristles. Even if we were to use a small brush like a liner brush, you would still have a collection of bristles making markings and therefore making a larger application, where this one is significantly smaller, more detailed, and great for realism, especially on a canvas which isn't too large, such as this one, as this canvas is only about, I believe, 8 by 10. And for those of you who wonder why often I use such small canvases for these lessons, it's just so that the lessons don't take too long. The more detail you can incorporate, the more time it takes to paint, and the larger the canvas you work on, the more detail you can incorporate, right? So I try to make these in 2 to 3 hours, but if I went with a much larger canvas, then it might take 7 or 8, right? So we just do it to help you learn as quickly and efficiently as possible without doing a 10-minute time-lapse painting where, I might just add music in the background. Not that there's anything wrong with that. That can be great for picking up the basics and getting a preliminary understanding of a certain subject. I do watch them occasionally myself, but I really wanted the lessons on this channel to be something you can take a lot away from, really learn from. So we go with the longer videos, but we don't make them too long by ensuring the canvas isn't massive. And here you can see I'm jumping around quite a bit, very intentionally, because we can kind of subconsciously create patterns, and that randomized effect is something that's incredibly important through these markings. So by jumping from one area of the canvas to another, we can essentially kind of give ourselves a little reset. And if we don't get that reset, it's okay, because our markings that are similar are far away, so you can't really tell that they're that similar, right? Because you have different markings in between. And hopefully by the time you get to that in-between part, you've kind of broken out of that habit or learned that you're doing it, a different way of going about it. A lot to think about, right? But here we are, again, using different areas of the brush, frequently rotating. It's also worth noting that I'm only rotating in the air. I'm never rotating once the brush hits the canvas, because then you end up rendering streaks, and that's not what we're looking for here. There we go. I'm also going to do another application with this, but only towards the bottoms, because the bottom area isn't going to get as much light, right? The top of the trees is going to cast shadows and create more shadows. So the higher up, the less of the markings you want, the lower down, more of them. And we're essentially going to end up with a gradient, a pattern moving up from the bottom. This also isn't the final layer, so don't worry if it looks incomplete, because it is meant to look incomplete. It's all part of the layering process. And for those of you wondering, because I always get asked the question, I'm using predominantly Winsor & Newton acrylic paints, and I'm using my soon-to-be brush line which will be coming out later this summer. So you can ensure that you render the exact same markings that I am here in unique areas like this. Also, up over on Patreon, whenever I post the lessons, I also post a photo of all of the paints and all of the brushes that I'm using, so you can see exactly what the material list is, but I also like to type out the material list in the general video description, so lots of different options for figuring things out. Really like that though. Now I think we let it dry and we jump into the next step. So now we've let everything fully dry to the touch, and we're going to take that 1-inch flat-headed brush, grab some of our sap green, about an equal mixture of a primary yellow. You could also use a cadmium yellow. We'll do a good mix there. We'll thicken it up with about, again, an equal amount. So the same amount as the yellow, the same amount as the green in our titanium white. And then a hint of our Mars black. We don't really want to darken the pigment, but we do want to desaturate it. We could also use a hint of red, but this will just keep our palette a lot more concise and easy to work with. And I really like that pigment, so I'm going to get the majority of it off this brush. I'm going to switch over to our liner brush, fantastic for real detail work. We'll make sure it's nice and damp. Grab some of our pigment, get close to the canvas, use our pinky finger to brace our hand, and then from the top, I'm going to start tapping on highlights. Now, these markings are going to be larger than that of what our fan brush rendered, and that's intentional. Here, rather than shadows, we're painting on actual foliage, and we're starting at the top because in this piece, the light is coming from the top down. It's very high in the sky, but it's moving this way. So we need to ensure that the tops of our trees are getting the most light, the most of this initial highlight layer. We're going to do more. We need to build them up over time, but we'll have it dissipate as we move downwards. We'll also create random openings where it's a bit darker to instigate some additional realism, because you will have some areas that just have more foliage than others. And you can see that I'm going back and really filling out different portions of the top. That said, I get that you're pretty far away, so let's get you closer for some of the detail work. Here we are, now again towards the top. Lots of taps, and I'm trying to be fairly random with a lot of my directional work, but I will have them as a whole kind of moving in this direction. And I'm doing that so that we have a bit of a leading line, or rather a collection of leading lines through pattern that bring us down towards the center of the painting. Though I'm throwing in enough in other directions, here there's some moving like that, that it doesn't look too obvious or intentional, right? We still want it to look natural above all, but if we can kind of sneak in some subconscious visual routes, our nature painting will compositionally excel, right? The composition isn't just your line work and the initial drawing, it's also the brush strokes and the details, the patterns, how they all move and work together. Now you could also use a fan brush for this. Ideally a soft fan brush where the bristles do condense together, unlike the stiff fan brush which we use for the darker application, but that really will randomize a lot of your applications, and I wanted to go in with this having more control, right? So different options. That said, By painting up close like this, we obviously sacrifice the ability to look at the painting as a whole. So if you are like me and you are nice and close to the canvas, do make sure to take those steps back and ensure that it's progressing as a whole the way you want. In fact, let's do that for a little while. Now, yet again, a bit farther away. By the way, while the camera was off, I did remix some of that pigment because mine was starting to dry on the palette. I often get asked the question, how do I keep my paint wet for the entirety of these painting sessions? And there isn't a technique, there isn't some secret. It really is just that I remix my paint. And sometimes I do it on camera to show you that it's a good habit to get in of remixing your paint, because you'll know your mixes better, you'll know the paint better, so the next time you want to create those colors, you'll be in a much better place to do it. But if it's just going to be very repetitive, I will mix it off camera. And so I did. One of those scenarios. Now when you go back over your previous applications, you can brighten it up to a greater degree because you're working a lighter layer on top of a lighter layer, rather than if we work in a new area, say towards the left here, this won't be as bright because we're working a lighter layer over a darker layer. And even when you use a thick amount of paint, acrylics are semi-transparent, so you will typically be able to see a little bit of the underlayer. So do expect for the application that you make on the canvas to be different from what you have on the palette. Not dramatically, but you can get what you actually have on the palette through multiple layers, and that just means letting areas dry, coming back to them, and then reapplying. That said, because of that, needing to let it dry, I like to jump around a lot. Just give areas time to do exactly that. But it also gives me time to kind of visually assess areas and then go back and make them what I really want them to be. So I don't have to overcommit to any in the moment, which I think makes a lot of the paintings a whole lot stronger. Also, as I get towards the left-hand side, I'm going to start coming in with some applications that don't move, for the most part, down this way, but instead down this way. So, again, leading lines through our larger textured movements. And I say textured more so as a pattern rather than a physical texture. You can get physical texture with acrylic paints, but you need to use a lot of paint, because typically as acrylics dry, they shrink to about a third of what they initially were. So you can do it through layers and you can build it up, and it is achievable, but it isn't necessarily the best medium to attempt that sort of thing. If you really want a lot of texture, do try working with oils. If you do so, work outside or in a very well ventilated room. Personally love oil painting, but I feel like I've never really had a studio space that is extremely conducive to moving the air out properly. And for that reason, I do a lot more with acrylics, but of course you can paint outside, on a balcony, in a backyard. You can do some painting, different trails and whatnot, but it's starting to turn out quite nice. I like that. I think I've been painting little taps like this for probably 10 minutes at this point, but goes to show you that you don't have to rush, and sometimes just taking your time really will render you the best results. Get you what you really want. Again, we could have done this probably in 3 minutes with a fan brush, and the fan brush worked great for the detail underneath, but for what I'm doing right now, I wanted that detail, I wanted that precision, and it's paying off. I'm not going to do as many taps, by the way, over here on this spot. Not for any reason of the sun or how light is supposed to move within the context of this painting. I'm just going to do less because I want a slight vignette effect to bring the eye in towards the center of the painting. The eye naturally goes to the brightest point, and if you make the edges a little bit darker, then the eye goes to the middle. So with that in mind, keeping that a bit darker, and I'm going to continue moving some of these highlights down. You can tell that I very slowly work my way down in a lot of these areas. That way I give myself time to kind of process them, how they look, how I want them to look, if I'm okay with continuing to add more of these brighter hues and values. Sporadically, I'll add in little ones down here, but not to a great degree. Then to make it cohesive, I'll work them in other areas. There we go. Now, we will continue with another layer, but we'll make it a bit warmer and a bit brighter. So I'll take about double the amount of yellow that I was using. This is dry, by the way, just to go back to our conversation about that. I'll use a similar amount of titanium white. I'll mix that in slightly with our previous mixture so that it has a bit of green in it. You can see the green's actually still quite strong. I grab a little bit more yellow, a little bit more titanium white. That's really nice, actually. That looks like the sun is soaking it up. Now, we need our detailed brush. So I'll add some water to my liner, clean off the previous mixture, and head in with this significantly brighter, more prominent hue, which, as you can tell, is bright in relation to what we had, but in relation to what we have on the palette, it looks a lot darker because we're working on colors that are quite a bit darker. All part of the process. There we go. Grab more of that. Head to the top. Lots of little taps. Thinking directionally. Now we are working with pigment that does stand out, so while I'm close applying detail, we do need to be much more careful, and we do need to take those steps back more regularly to ensure that we're not overdoing a certain area, underdoing another, that we're essentially just not negatively affecting the balance that we've previously instilled in the painting, right? I'm not going to do too much more up close. We'll take those steps back and we'll analyze from there. Doing those self-critiques is just so important. Something else you can do, by the way, I have a camera right behind the painting, obviously, but what you can do if you don't have a camera is you can put a mirror on the opposite side of your room, and you can just turn your head, look at the mirror, see the reflection of the painting in the mirror, and it'll look like it's so much farther away. And that's typically also just a great way of painting. And sometimes you almost find yourself painting while looking in the mirror rather than looking at the painting, and it's actually a good technique that I'd recommend trying if you have the room, have the mirror, and don't have any obstructions within the room, like a camera. Hopefully you're enjoying this longer process of painting it, by the way. I know that it is something we could have sped up or cut out, but I feel like there's still, or there have still been quite a few good lessons within the repetitive nature of this subject. So I'm just slowly working it down. You can really be a perfectionist with this. Okay, I'm going to take a couple of steps back. So at this point, I'm quite happy with the amount of detail, the amount of light. We still have that gradient coming down. We have all of the patterns moving in the directions that we want. So I'm going to move on to the next step, which involves our flat-headed brush. I'm going to make sure that it's nice and damp, also fairly clean. Over here on my palette, we now have a burnt umber, which I'm actually going to start with, and I'll mix that right here. So we're not going to cover the entirety of these, that way we can use them later for reference, but it's in a general vicinity, so we can use it to kind of look at how it'll be beside our pre-existing colors on the painting beforehand. So I start with the brown, and I'm going to grab an equal amount of our sap green. Get a very nice earthy green in here. Then I'm going to want to thicken and desaturate it. So I'll grab some titanium white, then about an equal amount of Mars black, which will be very dark. It's going to make this mixture significantly more, as you can see, akin to what we have here, but it's a bit earthy, which is great for our tree trunks, which we are about to endeavor into. Now, with this, you're probably wondering, why did you incorporate green into tree trunks? Aren't they brown? Well, if they have moss on them, and these do, you're going to have quite a bit of green. And we're going to have a lot of green hues just reflecting in the general atmosphere as well, because we have a lot of green foliage. And also, bark, a lot of trees actually do have quite a bit of green in them. They also have a lot of gray, and gray adopts the colors around it. So, for all of those reasons, we are incorporating quite a bit of green into our mixture here. So what I'm kind of starting by doing here is I'm looking for the most prominent trees that we still kind of have left. I'm rendering them through a series of markings. You'll notice that I don't grab pigment, go to the top, and then make a singular line down. I'm purposefully making many strokes. That way the tree's movement has a lot of start and stops, which is really, really nice because it's a natural look. Where if I just, and you know what, I'll do it for one of them. It's not going to look great, but I feel like it's important for the lesson. If we just pick one, and do that, it's such an unnatural look for the tree. You don't have any areas that are kind of protruding outwards. You don't have any starts to where branches are or used to be. It's very soft looking. So I'm actually going to fix it now by going back and making a bunch of different markings to give it more unique, distinct edges. Also, it's important to consider that your tree should always get larger as you move towards the bottom. And I think we'll move you a bit closer to the canvas, but something I want to do first is redraw on the rest of my branches. Again, you can go back to the start of the video, see where they're drawn there. You can make them up yourself if you feel confident in rendering them realistically, or again, the traceable is up over on Patreon, but I'm just going to sketch those in, and then we'll get back to painting together. Okay, so we are back with drawings and paint. So I'll grab some of that paint, again, head in. I typically like to start at the top of these, because the tops are the areas that are the most slender. They need to be the most visually clean as they stand out against a much more simple backdrop. So if the top or bottom is to be messy, via you essentially running out of paint and dragging a little bit, maybe applying more pressure than you should, it's better that the bottom is rather than the top. If you have a real inclination, real need to paint the bottom first, you can do that, but I would recommend going about it the other way. There you could see that I actually did mess up a little bit. Added an extra stroke where I shouldn't have, but we're going to change it by expanding this, filling this in, and now it's just a much larger tree, with the bottom still being larger than the top. Now we do need to go over this one again because it was quite thin. There we go. Between each tree, I'm also dipping my brush in a little bit of water to ensure that the brush is somewhat clean for the next application, but also that I'm able to drag my paint out a little bit farther, and that my bristles, most importantly, are very condensed. You want your bristles to be together so that you can make the smallest, sharpest markings possible. And then you can expand via making additional strokes, or by pressing slightly harder with the brush, expanding your bristles. There we go. Now these areas up here, much more delicate, much smaller. May want to switch to the liner brush for those. But before I get to any of that real detail work, we do have some larger trees to still work in, and when I do these, when they're very large like this, I like to do the edges first. And then I'll grab an abundance of paint and I'll come in and I will paint the middle. But I don't essentially do the top and then work my way down through all of it. I start with the sides because, again, that's where you need the most intentional, crisp, sharp markings. And it's just much easier to achieve if you are solely focusing on them. Now this pigment, as you can see, is a great color, but it's very thin. You can still see the canvas showing through. We'll need to do at least one more layer for this subject. Again, doing my edges first, working my way out with multiple strokes. Applying more pressure with my brush as I get towards the bottom to make those larger strokes. These trees are definitely too small for this brush, but over here, this one is not. It's important to have your trees kind of crisscrossing here and there. That way it's a three-dimensional space. There we go. Now, put that brush down, switch to the liner, grab some pigment, might brace my hand on the canvas, and make some smaller branches. Again, lots of little tap and drags rather than singular elongated ones. Very intentional. These are also quite thin. We'll need a second application, which is definitely the route to take rather than trying to force on more paint by pressing harder, because that will just make your markings bigger than they should be. You can see how frequently I'm going back to the palette for these small ones because the liner brush can't pick up that much paint. So you frequently have to go back and grab more. I did my drawing with Conte, spelled C-O-N-T-E. It's essentially a colored chalk, and I love it because it allows me to allocate different colors to different subjects. So these branches I kind of have in brown here. But as long as you don't press hard, you can typically take it off with a wet cloth when your painting is fully dry. So you don't have to commit to everything you've drawn if you feel like you want to simplify it once you start putting paint on. Because typically, things look a certain way when they're drawn, and then when you start to fill it out with paint and hue, you might feel quite different about how much detail, how many subjects you actually want. So it kind of gives you an opportunity to not commit to filling out the drawing should you not want to, and not having to cover it up with paint. But we are going to add a lot of foliage in through all of this. So we are going to cover areas that are a little bit messy or that we might not love with ease. So if you have an area that's kind of rough, don't worry about it. We have a very simple, reliable answer to deal with it. But we are going to take our time and try to get most of these as clean and correct as we possibly can, because that does make our job later easier. It's also just a good habit to get in, right? We put care and time into our work, and I think often we are rewarded for doing just that. I'm going to make a very watery mixture for these, and I'm going to not talk while I do them because it's difficult to paint and talk at the same time, real detail. So we're going to get about 30 seconds of silence. Very watery so that the blue of the sky can show through a little bit. And these can look a bit farther back, which is why they look so small. I guess I'll also add that if you're finding that through these quiet periods you actually really like it when I don't talk. Because I got a couple comments last week where people in the comment section were saying, it's a great painting, but is there a version where he just doesn't talk? To which my initial response in my head was, it's a lesson. You know, do you go to a lecture at a university and then you don't listen? It didn't make sense to me at first, but perhaps they're not really trying to get all of the tips and all of the different techniques, and that's fair. But if you do find that you prefer these when I'm quiet, and to, I guess, answer those comments, you can just mute the video and you can put on music that you like. I won't be offended. It's okay. It was just a really funny comment to get multiple times. But the answer is yes. There is a way to watch these videos without sound, and you just mute the video, and then you can put on a podcast or music or whatever you like. But again, you don't get all of the tips. So I don't know. It's just really funny. Also, there were a lot of very lovely comments as well, and I'm very grateful for those. So to everybody who does take the time to just leave something positive or kind, I do appreciate that, because it balances out the other ones that confuse me occasionally, So, to all of you who are there and just a very positive part of the community, thank you. And to all of those of you who have muted me, post my suggestion, or, that's okay too. We definitely need to go back in and do a second layer. I'm going to do it the exact same way as the first layer, so I don't think I'm going to film that portion just because it'd be very repetitive, but we will jump back in together for potential extra branches, details, etc. Things that we didn't cover with the first layer.
Now, on second thought, before I go ahead and apply the second layer to all of our trees, I want to do something else, do something a little bit different. It wasn't initially planned, but I think it can be beneficial to my painting and likely yours as well. Now, it can be done before you paint these trees in, but it can also be done after. Now, currently the background foliage has a lot of contrast, and typically when something is very close to us, you see that contrast, you see the darks, you see the lights, it's very noticeable and stark. However, when things are farther away, they have a lot of atmospheric light, it kind of blends those values together. And so this right now appears fairly close to us, and we can push it back if we want to create more depth. In this scenario, I do want a little bit more depth, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a glaze to this, which is going to make it look a little bit warmer. Doesn't have to, but it is an option. You can also make things look cooler. And it's also going to flatten the values minorly, pushing it farther back in the painting, which is my real goal here. So I'm going to grab a 1-inch flat-headed brush, make sure it's nice and damp. I do want this to appear a little bit warmer than it currently does. So I have some cadmium yellow deep hue on my palette here. It's a warmer yellow than what we were previously working with, and this is how, again, you can make a color warmer or darker. But we'll grab some of that, and I'm also going to grab a hint of titanium white, probably about half the amount of yellow that we had. That way it's still fairly yellow, but it's going to make the value of the pigment, so how light or dark it is, a bit brighter. And that means all of the darks that we have within here will be a bit brighter, so there won't be as much contrast before the darks and the lights. With that, I'll grab some of this pigment, move it over on the palette, grab some extra water. You want it to be very watery, that way it's quite transparent. And then I'm going to work that over all of my foliage. You can see that as I work over the trees, they also get brighter, but that's fine because we're doing a second layer. But that's why you can also do this before you start painting your trees in the first place. And I'm just going to try to get a very even coating across all of the background. I'm applying very little pressure with my brush so I don't get very noticeable streaks or patterns. And you can incorporate more titanium white or more yellow. You can even use the original yellow if you don't want it to be any warmer. I'm also using the sharp corner of the brush to work delicately around the edges of the foliage. That way I don't have awkward spots of yellow in the sky. And you can do many layers like this. I like to start with something much more subtle and slowly build depending upon how I'm feeling about the rendered result. As you can see, starting to dry a little bit. You don't want to do too many layers while it's wet because eventually you'll just have too much water and you'll be ripping pigment off of the canvas that you don't want to. So something to be relatively careful with. And with that, I'm going to let it dry. Might do another layer, probably won't. I think I'm quite happy with that. It's not overly warm, it's not too far away, it's not too close. It's a good balance. And provided I like that, again, I can go in and do the second layer for all of the trees, which is just essentially going over them one more time. Now, I've been applying a very simple second layer over the larger trees, but I wanted to do these small ones here with you. So, I'm taking some of that paint, and typically I like to start from the top, but I'm not going to do that from the very top this time. I'm going to do that from a point where the tree should start to get larger, and then as I start to run out of paint a little bit, I will move out my branches just a little bit. And I'm doing it this way because I actually want the tops of these smaller branches to be quite
transparent to a point. Very subtle, as you can see, or maybe not even see. But the idea is that it gets more opaque the farther down we get. We get more contrast, there's less light working through the trees and wrapping around the branches. Because when the branches are that small, the light really has a big effect on them. So we'll grab very watery paint, work our way up, let it run out. Try to keep the branches nice and small. Occasionally you can work down, but do be careful with it. And you can see how it gets very opaque, and then it's kind of semi-transparent, and then it's quite transparent towards the top. We can also make very transparent marks by adding a lot of water to our mix, so it's almost like watercolor or a wash. But when we go over something like the sky, which is very bright, as you can see, it gives us a really subtle look. And I'm trying to apply less and less pressure the higher we get, so that I continuously get smaller markings. We're just working these all out, making it look as natural as we possibly can. We started with the larger bodies of the trees, and then we started to create something much more subtle and soft looking. Now we could continue adding more of these smaller branches to the larger trees, but I want to wait until we have foliage there so that we don't accidentally overcomplicate things and force ourselves to add too much foliage to make up for the amount of branches. So in the meantime, we are going to make our trees three-dimensional. I'm going to take that 1-inch flat-headed brush. We're going to head over to the darker mix, which we've been using for the first layer of the trees. I'm going to go with about a good amount of our brown and then half that with our sap green. I'm going to use about half that in titanium white, and then I'm going to grab a small amount of Mars black and create this brighter iteration of what we've been using, right? Then, to actually apply it, we switch back to the liner brush, grab that, and when we go in to apply this, I'm going to take my pinky finger, put that on the canvas so that I can eliminate shake from my hand. And I'm just going to, through a great number of strokes, work down the right and left hand sides of our trees. We're doing this on both sides because the light is very high in the sky and it is behind these trees. It's also slightly to the left, so we can add more of a highlight to the left hand side of the trees, but I do still want a little bit on the right hand side because, again, it's high in the sky and it is to a point behind these. Now I'm using a fairly watery mixture to apply it initially, and this is just going to give me the cleanest stroke possible. It's also going to give me a very subtle look, which I like. Avoid going on the bottom of branches that are more horizontal. Instead, go towards the top of it because, again, the light is on top. I know that my markings right now are quite subtle. Might be difficult to see, but that's kind of a good thing, kind of intentional to a point, right? We want to portray it accurately. When I started this channel, long time ago, probably not 10 years, but close to it, I would really zoom in and I tried to make every piece of it incredibly noticeable, every stroke, right? But I think an issue with that was that it gave you a false sense of how highlighted, how bright, how much something should stand out. And when we do things like this that should be subtle, I like to paint them from a natural distance. That way you don't see this highlight and you think, oh, okay, I'll make that extremely bright, I'll make it really stand out, when it's not supposed to. It's a small, gradual build-up. Nothing too dramatic going on here. Continuously just going back layer by layer. You can use less water, do less layers, but it's going to make the process less malleable, less in your control. So if you're very confident, it's something you can do. But I personally like to take my time and just make sure that it's progressing in the way that I want it to. Get very subtle. And we've been focusing predominantly on the center and the left. Here we're moving over to the right. Now that you've also seen just how subtle it is, maybe I will get you closer up, but I'm not going to change the mix at all, and we're going to still keep it subtle. So here we are, nice and close. Working on that left-hand side of our tree. Working from typically around the middle all the way down, and then I'll kind of go up and I'll get the top again. It's very watery, you can see there's almost a drip to it. And I might take the excess over to another tree. You can also build the highlight up over time in layers. But I really don't want my trees to have too much of a contrast. I just want them to have a little bit of depth. Right? Make them look three-dimensional. But still somewhat silhouetted because the light is behind them. There we go. Grabbed a fairly thick amount of paint there. This might be slightly more prominent, not intentionally, just because we grabbed more paint. That's okay, because different trees will react to light differently. Creating a bit of a randomized look is still very important in this process, as it'll make our trees unique and therefore natural looking. And we'll just work on the top of this one, this broken tree here. This is horizontal for the most part, so we'll go on the top of it. This one isn't quite horizontal, despite its bends. There we are. You can get a little bit of the texture of the canvas showing through. It's also quite nice because it acts as an extra detail. Here I put a line essentially through this branch, implying that the branch is behind this one, giving us a little bit of extra depth. Something to consider. And I'm going over previously applied trees to build up those highlights, because as we know, when you put a lighter pigment over a lighter pigment, you render a pigment that is closer to what you actually have on your palette. There we go. Just take some steps back and just make sure that it's looking good. So all of our smaller trees to the mid-center and right-hand side are looking fairly good. Left-hand side, yet to do that, and I thought I'd show you that I'm actually just going to use the 1-inch flat-headed brush for this one, because it is quite large, and doing so with the liner just isn't necessary. I worked that edge, and now I'm kind of tapping inwards a little bit, leaving openings. That way it looks like there's separation between highlighted bark. And then I'll also just do a little bit on the other side. Not as much. Not dragging it in. Really just following the same rules that we've kind of pre-established. Grab a little bit more. This is horizontal enough that it would get a highlight on top. And work its way into the back of the tree. We'll add a little bit to the bottom, but not much. And then the right-hand side right there. Something else we can do, now that we have it instigated everywhere, is just add a little bit more titanium white to the mixture. We'll make it a bit more gray, but brighter. And then again, we can do essentially more of the same. Here you can see I'm just going in with taps so that I can get that nice bark effect on the larger tree. You really want to get this on the edges, but we can also use it on these if we want to. Not mandatory, it's really just about how much depth you want to create in these trees, but I would warn you, this is something you can continuously build up and make more and more stark, more noticeable, more detailed, which initially we think of as great things, but we do need to ensure that it doesn't get overly complicated so that when we apply the foliage, it's still balanced. So I think I'm actually quite happy with that. And while a lot of us are probably really excited to get to that foliage, we do need to wait. We need to do another step, a small one first, that being the sand down here, because we're going to have foliage that layers on top of the sand, and it'll be a lot easier to paint the sand first, layer that foliage on top, rather than painting the foliage, then painting the sand around all of the intricacies of the foliage. So let's head down, get a little bit closer, and start our mix. Now, there are two primary areas of sand here for us to work with. I'm going to continue using the 1-inch flat-headed brush because it's great for blending. This is going to be relatively bright in relation to what we were using. So I'll mix it in a new area, get some burnt umber, about an equal mixture of our titanium white, get a nice brighter brown. We'll grab a hint of green so that it's cohesive with everything else, maybe a little bit more. Just like so. And then I will just start painting on the back of our sand. Again, to be covered in large part with foliage. And I will paint the entire area that that sand is going to cover. We're using a lot of titanium white, so we might not have to do a second layer, as titanium white is just an inherently very thick pigment. Going to blend the top line a little bit so it's just a bit softer, rather than being a typically hard line, as it's quite far away. I'm not going to see that much detail. I'll get a slightly brighter variant, a little bit more titanium white, but not that much. And we'll move over here. Yet again, just block in the area in which we will have sand. Then, grab a little bit more green, a little bit more brown, and a hint of Mars black. And this is what we'll use for the shadows. Just like so. Now, what's going to determine our shadows? The foliage and how it comes down here. So I'm doing a lot of taps, and I'm doing that very specifically so that it looks like the branches and the openings are coming down. So we still have some light shining in this area. I might want it to be a little bit more brown. as you move up. But you can see I'm tapping, I'm leaving openings. And we'll just bring that all the way back, actually. You can also soften the edges by going over them a couple of times. Give it a bit more of a muted look. Maybe there's a bit of wind, there's a sway in the trees, and therefore their shadows aren't as noticeably sharp. But I'm going to go back with my highlight, reintroduce some of those openings, do some slight blends. You can also use the 1" if you'd like to instigate some real detail. Just softly blending so it's not as stark. Go back to the shadow pigment and just kind of work between the two until you have the mixture you really want. That said, as this dries, I can tell that I do want a second layer. And because it's drying, I can go ahead and just add that layer now, which is great. Brightening it up a little bit. Using the corner of my brush to work around some of those details. But again, we can always just reinstigate the shadows. There we are. One of those subjects that's just fun to continuously refine, as you can do a lot of different things with it. It's easy to change, and you can be fairly playful in the process. Very soft wipe over all of the shadows with the brighter pigment to have it blend and get that coarse, sandy look as well. Now, for another very fun part of the process, we are going to work with that 1" flat-headed brush. Again, very versatile, we can do a lot with it. And we're going to do the mid-value layer for a lot of our foliage, not only down here, but also up in our trees. So, we have our previous sets of green. I know that that's what I initially used, and that's why we keep pigment on our palette. We can use less yellow in this if we want, because we are moving to a less open area that's receiving a less direct light. But we'll just start by mixing as we did. You can see that we're not going with the first pigment we mix, but we eventually get there. I like that a lot. Now, when we go in and we apply this, I'm going to rotate my brush quite dramatically and use that sharp edge to render the ends of a lot of foliage. I'm also going to use it to cut along the edge of the top of the sand here, just like so. Now, in the reference photo, it kind of amalgamates with the background to a fairly grand degree. I'm going to be somewhat careful of that, but a lot of this is covered. So we can work fairly loosely. I'm going to hold my brush a little bit farther back. Do that very intentionally. That way I have less of an intentional effect on my markings. And don't worry, we're going to do a lot of refining of these markings with a different brush. We're kind of just applying the more dominant larger areas right now. And if you end up with something that's a little bit textured or inconsistent in hue and value, that's actually okay. As you can have different types of foliage, light hitting it in different ways. It's just going to make it more interesting. So we'll just finish using what we have on our brush. There we go. Use an X-shaped pattern to deliver a strong application, both vertically and horizontally. Again here, have a sharp line. And we essentially need to work in that area, provided we don't knock over the easel. I feel like I always get larger, more sturdy easels, but some days I'm just a little clumsy. And it doesn't matter how big it is. It's coming down. But we will be careful. There we go. Not overworking it. This is something where if it's not very thick, we can go back and add a second layer. Said, we are not done. We have a lot over here as well. As we can see, a lot of negative space. I didn't have that much paint left on my palette, needed to mix more, so I just grabbed more water from my brush, which thinned the paint. And that does mean this area will need a second layer. But that's okay. Second layers are good for painting. Now we'll get a little bit closer and start working with our filbert brush. As you can see, it has a very sharp body, but it also has a rounded top. So you can use the top for details, you can use the edge for details, but you can also use the corners, which are rounded, for softer blends and unique markings. Great for things like foliage. And that's how we're going to add a lot of detail into our foliage through here. Now, the top in this area has a lot of our greenery. So I'm going to start applying a cluster, as you can see, by rotating my brush, and occasionally I do a little bit of a drag. You can see we're leaving openings as well, just like so. Going to go back, thicken the larger portions. And I'm going to paint all of this foliage slightly smaller than I really want it, because I'm going to go over all of the edges with a lighter pigment to show that the light is working around and through our foliage. I'm also trying to keep lots of little openings in our clusters. I'm working sometimes around, as you can see, are trees, and sometimes I'm working it over top of them. If you work it over top of them too much, don't worry. We can always go back and just repaint that brown back in, or rather that brownish green gray, because remember, it's not just brown, it's a real combination. There we go. And we'll have more down here, but I think I want to do the majority of that with a lighter yellow, because I don't want to layer it too much. With that, we'll head over here and continue the general idea, but I'm going to leave more of an opening towards the top. We have a lot going on right there. And now it's going to be more centralized. And start kind of connecting to the bottom that we've already instigated. So lots of overlapping with our trees. Still lots of openings and unique stylings. You can see that we made our first connection. I'll dodge the trees here and then connect it over here. Also, the reference photo does have all the foliage sketched in, so if you want to make it perfect, exactly like the reference photo, again, you can use that up over on the Patreon. And big thank you to everybody who is up there directly supporting the channel, making lessons like this happen. The channel is predominantly community funded, and I can't thank you enough for providing me with the opportunity to make these lessons for the community up here on YouTube. There we go. Just working that downwards, connecting it like that. It's going to look a little messy. If yours looks a little messy, don't worry about it. Part of the process. We are going to refine. We're going to add a lot more detail. We're going to make it more three-dimensional. We're going to do a lot to these areas that are going to make it significantly better. We're also, remember, painting it slightly less than we really want it, because we're going to go in with a lighter, more yellow hue for a lot of the edging. So don't worry too much about making this perfect. Acrylic paintings are meant to go through awkward stages, and that's okay. So many fantastic acrylic paintings have been started and they're let go of. They're dropped before people can really get to the details, the finite areas that bring it together. And it's a shame, because the potential is there, the talent's there, the painting is coming along, and it will look great if only those extra layers are finished and those awkward periods are passed through. So have faith in yourself, have faith in the process. You are capable of so much with some patience. That said, I like how this is coming along. I think I'm going to take a couple steps back, give it a good look. That way we're not too close when we make these larger decisions. So taking a step back, what we need to look at is the composition, the balance of detail, the balance of hue. Compositionally, I feel like it has a really nice movement that keeps us kind of coming back into the painting. This kind of acts as a bit of an arrow to draw us back in. There's a good flow to it, so composition is good. Value-wise, it's a mid-value. It, I think, will work well with some highlights and some darker hues, and we know that the hues are good because we matched them to our previous ones. So I like it at this point. It also doesn't feel overly detailed or complicated. Now, we're going to wait for it to dry. Mine is dry. It's very, very hot. Everything's drying quite quickly right now. And I'm going to mix up a darker hue. Here you can see the shadow pigment that we used previously. There's just a little bit of it left on the palette, enough for me to see and work with. And I'm going to make this one a little bit darker than that because we are closer to us in the painting now. Contrast will show to a greater degree because we have less of those kind of atmospheric reflections, less of that light kind of bouncing around everywhere. So I'm going to mix up a nice dark variant of our hue. Put that brush down and pick up, as I'm sure you know, the fan brush, very specifically the stiff bristled fan brush, because it's time for some detail. So I'll grab this. And what did we learn last time when we used the fan brush? Think about the application process, what we did, what we attempted not to do, and therefore how we apply this. Because something I really want to do with all of these lessons is not just give you a tutorial on how to paint a very specific scene, but rather give you the ideas, the methods, so that you can take them and incorporate them in future paintings, whether they be more from these lessons or reference photos of your own that you care about. So, with this, what do? We do a lot of rotating, a lot of tapping. We don't make this brush damp because we don't want to condense the bristles. We don't press the entirety of the brush into the canvas. We typically just pick about 1/3 of it. We also go back to the bottoms a second, third, fourth time and work that up because they are going to have more shadows than the top area. Just like so. But very similar application to what we did in the back there. Let's get you a little bit closer. Okay, so here we are, closer. We have some pigment. When we have an abundance of pigment, typically I like to start at the bottom. And then as we start to run out of paint, we work our way upwards. While the brush does have a typically linear application by rotating the brush frequently and fairly randomly, we can escape that general look. You can see that we had a lot of paint on this brush. Typically you don't want too much paint for these applications because the paint is wet and it can condense the bristles in a similar way that water can. By using a very stiff fan brush, you mitigate that risk to a fairly large degree, but it is still a risk. So, do be somewhat careful with that. Here I'm just going to get some of the paint off my brush at the bottom, and then once I do, we work up to this higher area. You can see that I'm swapping sides of my brush fairly regularly. I can tell that one side has more paint than the other, so to keep things balanced I rotate a lot. It's okay to have some areas that are a bit darker and more dense and some to be a bit more open, by the way. That's not a bad thing at all, because some openings are going to be deeper than others. Here we'll instigate one, here we'll instigate another. And the openings being deeper will just give us more depth, right? Sometimes we'll see subtle shadows, sometimes we'll see a lot and larger ones. Now I do want to make the bottom a little bit darker again. We are close to the foreground. We can use a lot of contrast should we want to. That said, we don't want to completely cover the mid value of green because it is what's offering the contrast. If it was all just dark pigments, then we wouldn't notice the contrast, right? Now I'm not going to do too much up in the top areas here, but we are going to do some. And I'm only applying this to the very center of our clusters. I don't really want it on our edges because our edges are going to be brighter. And it's really hard to work bright pigment over pigment this dark. I'm trying to stay within the viewfinder of the camera. There we go. Okay, let's move a little bit higher. Okay, So, heading back into our larger cluster, starting in the larger ones very specifically, so that I can get the majority of the paint off the brush, and then when it is, I work into the slightly smaller clusters. You can see that not all of the clusters are round or squared or rectangular shaped, and being able to use the elongated brush is actually very useful. Sometimes you want more of a line application than something blocky. So what was initially potentially a little tedious down here is actually very beneficial up in our current workspace. Also, we can always go back and add more of this foliage. So if you kind of feel like you don't have enough through the process, it's okay. It's the easiest thing to accentuate and build on very late in the painting process. Sometimes, you know, like with the trees or the sky, once you apply it, you kind of cover it with a bunch of other things. And so going back to it is difficult because it means you may have to change everything on top of it or reapply everything on top of it, right? It's not just changing one thing. But the foliage here is kind of our final top layer. Not this application specifically, we are going to go in with a bunch of highlight applications, but the subject of the foliage itself is the highest and closest to us, and therefore it is the easiest to go back and fix, add to, build on, all of that. There we go. And just a bunch of fun little taps and splatters. Nice randomization. I think that looks quite nice. Definitely ready for some highlights once we let all of it dry. And now that we're done with our fan brush, we are going to wash it quite well because we don't actually want paint drying on it. It's one of those things where we can't add water to it in the painting process, so we kind of do the painting process relatively quickly. That way we can wash it before the paint dries on it. And here you can see it's wet and all of those bristles have condensed, which is very much why we did not add the water. That said, if you have a lot to cover with the fan brush and you say, oh no, it's drying on the brush, but I can't add water, in that scenario, you do wash it and then you dry it completely using a cloth, paper towel, anything of that nature, and then you come back to the painting process. That way your brushes last a very, very long time. And by the way, again, these are the sample set from my brush line, which is coming out a little bit later this summer. They're working great. Little demo. I'm happy, I'm excited, and I'm going to have a lot of news to share with you about that very soon. But with that, I need to let this dry, and we'll go in, add some highlights. Now for some highlighted detailed foliage here in the foreground and in the midground with these trees. We're actually going to start with these ones right here. I'm going to use the 1 inch to do some mixing, and because the foliage here isn't dense at all, a lot of light can work through it, a lot of light can work around it. It's going to have a more similar profile to what we have towards the back here. So I'm actually going to go in with the cadmium yellow deep hue. Again, you don't have to use this if you don't want a warmer mix within your painting. You can stick to a primary yellow, a cadmium yellow. But here, I'm going to grab the cadmium yellow deep hue. I'm going to interject about an equal mixture of titanium white, and we do want to make it a green to an extent. So I'll grab a very small amount of green with the corner of my brush. I'll mix that in, and as you can see, it's really all we needed. Do a little bit more, but I don't think it's necessary. Just making sure it's a nice green. Put down our brush. Of course, again, you can also test on the reference photo linked in the video description or up on Patreon. We'll just grab our liner brush, grab some water, and we'll head in to painting some distant but very bright foliage. I know you're quite far away while we're painting detail. Just want to show you how subtle a lot of this looks from a distance. And then once you have an idea, I'll move you a bit closer, okay? Here we go. Allowing it to be a bit more opaque in the larger clusters. And then when I start to run out of paint and it's more just water on the brush, then I get towards the outskirts of those clusters. Just like that. And now let's get you a bit closer. So now for some of those nice little details, I did the majority of this side, but there are a couple more spots. You can just fill out, work in between these trees. This is also something that you can do before you kind of finalize your trees in the foreground and the foliage on top, but it's one of those things where you can add too much detail by accident. So while it's difficult to, well, somewhat difficult, I suppose, it's not really difficult, it's just not as easy to paint all of these around our pre-existing trees and foliage in the foreground. I think it typically will lead to a better painting because, again, you just have a better idea of how much detail you've already incorporated in the more important areas of the painting and what you can kind of balance with. There we go. I like that a lot. Now let's make it a bit more green. So sap green, work that in. I can use the liner brush here because I don't need to mix a lot of the paint. Liner brush can mix paint, it's just not great at mixing a lot of it. And now, again, in the center of the clusters, this is where we will apply the more green mixture, not in the outskirts. And it'll work really well kind of coming up from those areas. There we go. Working great. Love that. Okay, now we're going to take more of it using that same brush, and we'll find the edges of our previously applied clusters, and we can incorporate some of this nice yellow green highlight. And we're just tapping it on in a similar way that we would regular foliage. Trying to get all of my edges of the foliage itself, not the trees. There we go. Let's get a little bit farther back. Now at this point we're going to need significantly more of that pigment or something very similar, so I'll continue to grab that cad yellow, grab about an equal mixture of our green, titanium white to thicken it. We'll also brighten it a good amount. And I'm also going to add some Mars Black to desaturate it, a hint, not too much though. We are on the foreground and we can use more saturated pigments. This will be a nice transition pigment and something we can build on and make even brighter for additional layers. So, still using that nice little liner brush of ours. We'll work around the edges of our previously applied foliage as we've been doing. Here I'll hold my brush a bit farther out so I get a more randomized application. And typically what I would do is I would go around all of my edges, just ensure that they have that nice bright look. But while we're at it, to make things a little bit more interesting, this is a step that I would do, just in a different sequence, but not for any good reason, just kind of personal habit. That said, we can now use our liner brush to incorporate highlighted foliage on top of our darker background and base. So, this is going to be a top layer. We may have greater highlights on top of it, but it is a layer that needs to be well applied, very clean. So, when you go on to apply this, make sure that you have a decent amount of paint on your brush, that you're getting fairly opaque applications. Because while we were being thoughtful with our base layer and our darker set of details, we knew that we were going to put something on top of it. So we could be a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more messy. Here though, it does matter that we are conscious of our brush strokes and how we are rendering these trees, this foliage, all of it. And it'll be much more apparent the farther we get down, because we'll be applying it over darker and darker spots. Remember, the light is towards the top, which means the top area is going to get the most sun, the brightest of greens, and then it got darker as you move down. That idea is still in place, but we are going to have areas that really protrude, that do catch light through openings in the top. And because of that, we're going to have this very bright pigment next to a fairly subdued green, and it will really stand out. Currently trying to separate some of our foliage. So here we'll have a darker area, here we have a lighter area. I'll come down and start creating another one. I'm being somewhat directional with my applications to point us towards the center, but I'm not trying to make it obvious. Here we have this cluster now connecting to this cluster, opening in the middle. We have these darker areas, which we will leave darker, but we can apply some highlight around them. And we don't want too much highlight on the very far right or the very far left, because we don't want to disturb a natural vignette effect. Here you can see I'm overlaying on top of a lot of the previous trees, but not all of them. I'm going over some of my last applications as well, just to build them up, make them a little bit brighter. This foliage is quite distinct. Also, as we get closer to us, you can apply a little bit more pressure with your brush, make larger applications, because we're getting closer to this foliage, so it's going to look larger, right? Perspective is going to make it appear bigger than the foliage in the background. And an easy way of making it bigger, rather than going over it 2-3 times and slowly expanding, is very simply just to apply more pressure with your brush, as that alone will give you a larger imprint with the paint. Let's get you a little bit closer. Now, when I go about doing this, as you can see, because we're working on a darker background, a lot of these markings are looking quite dark despite the bright pigment on the palette. And again, the best way of remedying that is doing exactly what I'm doing now, going back over, doing a second layer, and just building it up so that we have a light layer underneath our light layer, rather than a dark one, the way it currently is. We can also go in with a greater highlight a little bit later. That is something I do intend to do. But we might as well make the more prominent applications, and there are quite a few of them, a bit sharper, a bit more opaque, as it will make a difference. See that? That said, we are not done applying that initial layer, so we can kind of come back down here and continue working on these. You can see that this sticks out in relation to the background because it has a larger contrast, and we're working with a brighter value than what exists at the bottom down there. Remember, we progressively made it darker, and for that reason this area can now succeed. And of course there was a legitimate reason within nature to do that. It wasn't just us preparing ourselves to make this more aesthetic. It had backing, which I think is important when you want to render realism. That said, you don't have to make your painting realistic if you don't want to. You're more than welcome to break the rules, take those artistic liberties. Creating art should be a freeing process, not necessarily one where you're always worried about making it exactly the way you see on a photo or a page. I like to use reference photos as guides, but then take them in my own direction to a point, make it my own, add those artistic liberties, and I just want you to know that you are more than welcome to do that as well. I think it keeps the painting process fun, healthy, helps you over time develop your own style while recreating other pieces or pictures. Just interjecting little bits of yourself in there, it's not a bad thing. Really don't want to do too much of this down here. It's quite dark in the reference photo. And I like having that area that's essentially rounded. It's the back, it's darker, we don't see the light coming through in the same way. I think that's nice. Definitely need to go back into this and add more highlights, but while I still have this pigment on my palette, I'm going to do this area as well, as it is also important. That said, a lot of it's going to remain quite dark, with the exception of this edge where the light's coming down and wrapping around, but it's a big tree, it's got a lot of shadows. Also, a lot of our foliage here was pushing in this way. This foliage is going to go that way, leading lines. Remember to leave open areas in your clusters for shadows, and to think of these things as clusters is generally a fairly good way of going about it. So not too much over there. And of course, if there's any area up top that you are yet to really add this around the edges or in the center, now is a good time to do it. Here, going back over a couple of spots. I personally still have a little spot, and it's really, really neat to look at that in relation to the other areas, just how it looks on layer 2 versus layer 3 or 4. Stark, dramatic difference between them. One looks much more finished and professional for sure. And that's just a good reminder not to quit when you're just getting started. We put in the time, and it just gets better and better. And by the way, that's also not the finished version. We still have techniques, we still have layers, we still have contrast and light to work in. I'm just taking a little break to do these areas as well. There we go. I'm liking it. Taking my time at this point so that I don't overdo anything. That way I can kind of continuously look back at it, make sure that I'm creating the right amount of balance. I'm also filling in a lot of this, so there's less of that dark center. It ends up removing detail because we have less contrast, but it makes it look like more light can wrap around, like it's smaller, like it's farther back. The sacrifice of detail is well worth all of the other benefits and implications. So I need to work it over this element of the tree. There we go. Also, if you overdo this at all, you can go back and add the sky color, and it's quite easy because the sky wasn't really a gradient, it was just a singular application. So adding in sky into a piece like this, very easy. Now the next step should be done from a little bit farther back. We're going to build on our highlights, but we want to be very cognizant of how it's working in with the rest of the painting. So I'm just going to grab an abundance of extra titanium white and an extra yellow. If you want the foreground to be a bit cooler, again, go with something like the cadmium yellow or a primary yellow. If you want it to be a bit warmer, cadmium yellow, deep hue. And for the foreground here, I think I actually want to go with something a little bit cooler, keep the background warmer, keep the foreground cooler, create a separation of sorts between the two. So we'll just build this up, go back and forth between the primary yellow and the titanium white. Get an abundance of paint off of that brush. Now, we look for the areas that really stand out, which are going to get the greater highlights. The ones that protrude, the ones that don't have shadows above them, or perhaps again there are just openings within the tree above where we are currently rendering. This is a great way of really bringing attention to your favorite areas. This is one of the most dominant, visually prominent areas, applications in the painting. So do try to be very mindful of where it is. This protrudes, this protrudes, this protrudes, and I'm just applying it to the ends that do. Here we have an area of light, and I'll just apply that towards the area that's most outwards. that has that dip, so we probably want to avoid it for the most part, and the area that extends out most can have a little bit of extra light. And then these bushes towards the top can definitely receive some, and it can work its way back down, but not too far, because again we want that wrap around. And then here we have a second bush, which is going to get a little bit of light as well. You can really see how it's starting to pop, move forward in the painting, create that extra depth. And that's the beauty of extra layers. And we've only done 4 layers now. A lot of this, and you can do so many more. You can do 10, 20 layers, depending upon the amount of time that you want to put into the painting. Subtly varying your pigments. I don't want to overdo this, so I'm going to hop to the left-hand side temporarily. Grab a bit more. Work that in, work this out. A lot of back and forth. This is also a great pigment for edges. Doing areas towards the top, we definitely need to make it cohesive. So we need enough of this in the top to make it feel like it fits within the bottom area. And again, edging is typically your best bet. So find an area of light that's kind of showing through, and then work around that. So much paint has been applied towards the top here, and it just keeps getting better and better. Again, a lesson in patience, a lesson in trusting the process, a lesson in trusting yourself. There we go. Taking our time and doing it right. Might get a little bit quieter while I concentrate. But at this point, you've probably heard me talk straight for 2 hours. So maybe that's okay. I've done this painting now over probably 5 days' time. So I really have no idea how long it is at this point. And I know that on there it'll probably show 2.5 hours. Maybe only an hour and a half. I don't know. But if you see that and you say, oh, how does that take 5 days? A lot of it is preparation. A lot of it is testing on other canvases. Typically, I like to do a draft version, and if I want to try something, I'll do it on that first, and then I'll come over here. Maybe I'll end up redoing it. And there's also just a lot of reorganizing steps in the most efficient way to layer things. And then there's also just days where I love this and I'm having fun, but I really want to paint a seascape. And, you might get a little distracted, start working on another lesson. And I'm telling you all of this because sometimes I get comments noting, oh, it's so impressive how you painted this in, 2 hours. It took me a week. And my response is always, no, it also took me a week. It's okay to take your time. There's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to finish your paintings quickly. In fact, I think in a lot of scenarios, the paintings end up being better when we do take our time, when we go back to it throughout the week, when we have time to digest it and our applications, right? So, just so you know, this painting is on day 4 or 5. And it might take 6. We'll see. Not too worried about it. I used to worry a lot about getting a painting video up every week, and that's something that I still want to do. But I almost found that if it's every other week, but the painting is twice as good as it would have been, then I feel like it's kind of just worth it to take the extra time, right? We have a big back catalog of videos and lessons. If you really want to paint something, there's a lot up there on the channel. And if you're on Patreon, there's a lot of ebooks full of traceables and ideas and bonus lessons. I just reorganized the tags on Patreon, by the way, for those of you who are up there. And I believe there's now a big painting tag. So if you want to do some of the 24 by 36 inch paintings that take 20 or so hours on video, and it's kind of like a 5-6 part series. I think there are 3 lessons, 3 paintings like that. So probably 60 hours of footage. They're pretty big. But if you want to find those, it's now easier. Slowly reorganizing everything up there to make it more accessible, easy to find, easy to work with. Because when I was uploading everything initially, Patreon didn't have the same tagging system. And we couldn't upload pictures with our videos in the same way. So I'm just kind of going back through the catalog and trying to make it as accessible as possible. Again, as a big thank you to everybody who is up there. Just trying to make your lives good the best I can. Also, I feel like I mentioned Patreon 4 or 5 times. Sorry about that. But I do want to say, again, a big thank you to everybody who is up there. And anybody who may be new here, this is your first time on the channel, up on Patreon we do have the traceables to make the drawing process a lot easier. Reference photos, images of all of the materials. So all of the brushes and the pigments that I use, so you can see the brands and all of that. You can also get access to our exclusive Facebook group where everybody shares their renditions, helps each other out. It's a very positive, friendly space, which I'm incredibly proud of. A lot of wonderful people up there, and a lot of just great artwork. It's always neat to see how these can be done in a slightly different way, or even a dramatically different way. I feel like I myself find that I get inspired too. But up there you can also get access to all of the ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners, which is essentially the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first acrylic painting, as well as ebooks full of traceables as previously noted. And I also want to revamp the tiers so that at a level you can also have your name towards the end, and I want to start doing something with critiques as well, but I'm not quite there yet. But if you're interested, you should get in there, get those traceables books, access to the Facebook group, and soon even more. There we go. Okay, I like this a lot, but I'm hesitant to add more because I want to do the bottom and then reassess balance within it, right? Don't want to overdo something and then make other portions of it awkward because of that. So we are going to clean our brushes, clean our water, and head down. So now we'll temporarily table the details up here. I do want to add in additional branches and highlights, but also openings in some of the foliage. But we're going to do this first so that we can manage our balancing. Now I'm going to get my 1-inch flathead brush, make sure that it's nice and clean. Head over to our palette. I'm going to grab not the warmer yellow, even if you are working with the warmer yellow. Here I'd go for regular primary yellow or regular cadmium yellow. I'll grab about an equal mixture of our sap green, about half that in our titanium white, and a hint of our Mars black as well. Mix up a good, slightly bright, not hyper saturated, almost neutral green. Now, when I go to apply this pigment, I'm going to apply it where the water is, and I'm going to start along the edges of the sand and the foliage, slightly overlapping the sand by just a little bit. And water itself is typically a reflection, color-wise, hue-wise, of what's above it. We have a lot of green. So we're going to start off by creating a very green base, which we can build on as we move forward. Here I'm going to work in between areas of foliage so it looks like the foliage is overlapping water. And then when I have the edge, I'll switch to using the entire body of the brush to fill in the larger gaps. Now, the layer that we are currently applying is something that we are going to cover up in its entirety throughout this process. But we want a green underlayer like we have, so that when we apply all of our detail with the moving water, if we miss any areas, or if any areas are thin, we still have green underneath to show through, rather than the white of the canvas. And we went with a slightly lighter green here, very purposefully, because if we went with a darker green, all of the lighter highlights that we applied would appear quite a bit darker. And by building light onto light, we can ensure that we actually get a pigment close to what we have on our palette, where the darker pigments on top of this will still just remain quite dark. So by going with a lighter base layer, and this isn't too bright, it's more of a mid to light value green, we just ensure that our further second, third, fourth layers are more accurate. Hope that makes sense. Also, it doesn't have to be a perfect layer, it doesn't need to be void of brush strokes, it doesn't need to be extremely thick. You can have some areas that are notably too thin. I have a couple. That's okay because we are covering it and we just need a base. That said, we do need to let this base dry, and when it does, we can draw back in our reflections and proceed to add in some detail and make it look like actual water. So now that we have everything fully dry to the touch, using the 1-inch flat-headed brush, I'm going to create a bit of a darker green, very similar to what we had in the trees. So it's a combination of burnt umber and our sap green, looking about for half and half. Get something nice and organic going. Make it a little bit darker with our Mars black. And I'm going to mix something that is a little bit darker than what we used in the trees, because reflections are typically, and water is typically slightly darker than that which it's reflecting. So here we have the original color along the edge. Here we have our new color. Just going to make it a bit more brown. And I'm not going to apply the pigment with this brush because it's far too large. Now we're going to grab a new brush, that being the smaller flathead. This one is about 1/3 of an inch, nice and clean still. So we'll dip that in water to condense our bristles and help keep our paint wet for a longer period of time. We'll grab this new pigment. We'll find our tree above, and then in a series of horizontal strokes. We will work back and forth. Now you have a couple options when you render this. You can make these slightly larger than you know they're going to be, and then overlap them to a point. Or you can make them slightly smaller, do the edging later, and then come back to them and expand them from there. The second option is slightly safer, but will require more layering and significantly more time. It's very much up to you. And for this process, what am I going to do? Probably a little bit of both. That way you get to see both sides of the process. Now, this looks incredibly stark and, to be honest, quite bad. But that's okay. That's how it is meant to look at this point. Again, we need to cover up all of the other green with the same pattern in different values and hues. And when we accomplish that, it'll look a whole lot better. So, as I've said probably 100 times in this lesson, trust the process, trust yourself, it will be a-okay. Here we have some trees that are very much being, essentially the reflection is distorted by the foliage around. So we'll just kind of add it in pieces. You can see that I'm skipping a large area in the reflection. There we'll have more greenery. And we have these little trees. You can do these with the liner brush if you want. You can also use the corner of this brush, much like the original 1-inch flathead. It has a lot of diverse applications, which is great. And when you go in and make these markings, typically, you're going to want to make the middle of the marking the largest, the most thick, and both edges should be a bit sharper. So you go in with very minimal pressure, and then you expand the amount of pressure that you use as you get towards the middle, and then you let it run out yet again as you get to the other side. And then you can go back towards the middle and do a second layer in that area, and that will typically turn out quite nicely. Now again, we will go back to it, but let's grab our 1-inch flat, make it slightly cleaner than it was. We'll go in for a darker green, so similar to what we have here on the palette, starting with an abundance of our sap green, titanium white, Mars black, significantly more Mars black though, because again, we are making all of these mixtures darker. But we are quite close in the foreground, so we can also make it a little bit more saturated. Here you can see the difference between that pigment and that pigment. Might make it a little bit brighter, but not by much. And then I'll get the majority of the paint off this brush and onto the palette. Switch back to the 1/3 inch flat, which will also be in the brush set. And now we can go in between a lot of these in the darker areas. So I'm looking for essentially the bushes, and we have a lot of those through here. And I'm going to leave these applications somewhat semi-transparent. So I'm not applying a grand amount of paint. My brush is quite damp. We can see the lighter green showing through to a point. One of the primary reasons of doing that initial base layer. And now here going in with a little bit more of a thicker paint, still leaving a lot of openings. This edge towards the right hand side should be a bit more thick than what we have in the center. Very specifically, 2 reasons. 1, there's a lot of shadow in the foliage over here. 2, we want to continue to instigate those casual vignettes along the edge, to draw the eye in closer to the center of the painting. Also try to keep the majority, if not all of your strokes, horizontal, as I'm doing. You don't want to start to accidentally add in a curvature to it, because that would imply a different kind of movement. And it's easy to do when you paint these in abundance and you work from left to right or right to left, because the hand naturally has a bit of a curve if you're working from the elbow. So just be very mindful of it, and it's fairly easily avoidable with some thought. Just going in and cleaning up this edge. There's a lot of darker shadows in the background there, which get brighter as we move up, so it gets brighter as we move down here on the reflection, which is great because we naturally just run out of pigment. You can see that I'm skipping entire areas. That's not because we are going to keep it like that. It's not because that's done. It's because I don't want to accidentally instigate the wrong kind of pattern and make it too obvious. Similar to reasoning that we had within the foliage, it's important to be mindful of those subconscious patterns that we can kind of innately have. And by jumping around, we avoid them to a better degree. Again, darker down here. I'm going to let it get lighter as we move up. And because of that, my next couple of mixtures are going to be a bit more watery. So I'll grab some paint on my palette, move it to a new area, add some water to that mixture. Start my next application in a previously dark area to get the first couple strokes of paint off the brush. And then once they are, I can start to move to these unfinished lighter areas, like so. Lots of little techniques and patterns to incorporate and to avoid. There we go. Need a bit more actual dark green. We have some light kind of working us up into the painting. I like that a lot. Now we don't need to mix a massive abundance of paint, so I'm going to do my next mix with the 1/3 inch flat. But I'm going to make a fairly bright green. Still use a hint of Mars Black to desaturate it, but not much. I say, okay, you know what? We have the top of like the bushes, which would be kind of there. We have more of like a wall of light here, and we have more of like a wall of light here because of how they work. So you can reincorporate that really beautiful undercolor if you happen to cover up a lot of it. And again, I want it here, cutting in between a lot of the trees. You can see we kind of have a gradient through pattern of light going to darker. Just going to take that paint off my brush and grab more because it was getting a little high on the bristles, and you don't really want it getting up towards the top because it becomes a lot harder to clean. There we go. I was going to go back and reincorporate some of the darker mixes, but I don't really think we have to. I actually really like them as they are, to be honest. We can do little micro changes with our greens. Kind of go back and forth between the lighter and the darker pigments. Been painting it from very far away, as you can tell, so that I get to see the balance as a whole. Do think that's quite important. Now, much like the top of the painting, we can always come back to do more layering on the bottom, but there is something else I want to add into the water here, and that is a slight ripple of the water, because the land is essentially very shallow through this portion, and there are rocks and bumps, so the water has a movement, as we can see, through the reflection, and as it moves over that, it creates this effect, which means that we're not going to get a clear-cut reflection in the same way that we do here. Instead, we'll see more water shimmering through almost like a bumpy aesthetic. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our 1 inch, going to make sure it's nice and clean. We don't want a lot of green in this mixture, so we'll find a dry spot on our palette, get a good amount of that titanium white, then we'll grab maybe a fourth of it in Mars Black, maybe a fifth. We don't want it to be too bright, we don't want it to be too dark, but we do want it to be on the brighter side of a gray. And then we're going to grab a small amount of our ultramarine blue for the second time in this painting. The first was, of course, just with the sky. We don't want it to be a true blue, we just want it to be a cool gray. So I'll get the majority of pigment off my brush, put that down, switch to our liner brush, make sure it's nice and damp to condense our bristles, and so we can get those nice clean sharp markings. We'll pick up that pigment, going to head in close, take my pinky finger, ground it to eliminate shake, and then I'm going to make 300 little markings. Maybe not actually 300, but also maybe more than 300. And these, you can see, we're quite close because I want you to be able to see the detail. These are essentially markings. I'm going to make it really large, where it goes from a small stroke, so very, very little pressure, to more pressure, to less pressure. You can see it's a bit of an arc, but it's incredibly small. And sometimes it's just a tap and a drag, depending upon how much space we have to work with. And this is, again, the water moving over a very shallow area. We get that nice shimmer. We're working it from the land over towards the left-hand side, letting it dissipate as we work into the shadow. You can see that it's becoming more watery. We're just running out of pigment on the actual brush. Grab a bit more. Going to continue working this along the edge to a point. That makes it look so much more professional up close. And then as I kind of move in this direction, the water is going to get deeper, so I'm not going to do as much, and I'm going to use less and less pressure. And I'm going to expand outwards a little bit, but not to a massive degree. And once you kind of establish that main area, the areas around should be a bit more watery, a bit more subtle. You can see it's kind of working out like a gradient. I'm trying to keep my hand out of the way for you. I'm going to do a little bit on the top, but not much. As you get farther away, this becomes really difficult to see. because it is a fine detail. Grab more pigment. Going to reestablish some of the more important portions because, again, we are working on a layer that is darker than our current mix, and we need multiple layers to build it up. And acrylic paints dry darker. So I'm going to take a couple steps back, give it a look. We're going to have interesting spaces where it's shallow and then it goes a little bit deeper and then maybe there's another shallow area. So we'll have one of those out here. It's not going to be huge. There we go. Incorporate a little bit of that over here, but not too much. There we go. It's working out nicely. And then again, just slowly expanding with the watery mixture that's left. Like that. Not a big subject, but a detail that definitely creates some nice variety visually in the painting. Interjects a new pattern, a hue that was reserved for the sky, so it kind of connects the bottom half of the painting with the top half to a degree. There we go. Then, from a bit more of a distance, we can grab additional titanium white, work that into what we were previously working with, and I'm trying to dodge all of the green and brown that we have in the titanium white. You really want the cleanest portion. Mix that into what we were working with, and then we can go back and we can apply this to the brightest areas, the most prominent. So really the center areas. It's a lot like the foliage that we have up here, but in reverse, where the edges were the brightest on the top, and here the edges are kind of the more muted, with the center being the brightest. There we go. Don't want to do too much. And as it dries, it'll be slightly less stark. And I'm just making the edges nice and subtle. Okay. Now, I think it's time we start re-adding some detail to important areas. Now, we'll head back up to the top, take our 1-inch, grab some burnt umber, go ahead and remix the brownish green that we used, and you can see I still have a little bit on the side left that I wanted to save for color matching. And we're going to instigate some smaller branches, smaller than we've applied before, to give us some extra depth, detail, and continue making the painting unique. So we get the pigment off of the big 1-inch, we switch to the liner, make sure the liner is nice and damp, grab that pigment, and then we're going to find areas, and I'm going to use the reference photo to a point, where there should be more branches, and I'm just going to start instigating them. Now, these are interesting in that we already have foliage implemented, so we need to make a lot of decisions regarding, is it going to go in front of or behind foliage? And often the answer should be both. So here, You can see it's coming off this tree, then it goes behind some foliage, and then it comes out for a second, and it goes behind, and it comes out. And you just kind of create these elongated, unique strands. Now here, I want to create some, because we essentially had two very similar branches occurring there, and I want to split it up visually. I want to make it more unique. So we're just going to build. Remember to make the bases larger. There we go. I'm going to make this larger as well, because you can tell that this branch is larger than the piece in which it spawns from. There we go. Let's add in a branch. Try to make it different from the one that we have just to the left of it. We're really looking for diversity amongst these. You can see this is getting lost in there. Make them up here, and then never again. But it could also split off once, twice. And that might reemerge up here. Create some interesting detail which previously kind of just didn't exist within that space. Also, we don't have a lot of branches that move more horizontally. We've been in this pattern of making them quite upright. So, we'll have this kind of spawn out of the foliage. And it can get lost behind there. But it too can and will have offshoots very simply like that. And it looks out of place, admittedly, because we just don't have enough other branches that follow its movement style. And once we incorporate them, it will fit. So if you do that, and you say, oh, that branch is just, it's too different. That isn't a negative on the branch that you're currently painting. It's a sign that you need to diversify the branches in your painting more, not simplify them. So here, now I'm trying to instigate significantly more of those until that feels like it fits within the rest of the painting. Need to know when to simplify and when to expand. Here's a big one coming out of this tree. And gets lost. And now this area makes sense. We just have to make sure that every horizontal branch doesn't look exactly like that one. That is the real challenge that comes with elaborating on the painting in that way. Also, if you're worried about doing too much of this, I will show you how we simplify areas, so don't worry about that. We also need more of this down in here. We've been doing much more with the top, not much at the bottom, but I need more paint. So, go back to our mixing brush, the 1-inch, Mars Black, Titanium White, Sap Green in abundance, Burnt Umber in abundance. And in abundance is a correct unit of measurement, right? At this point, we've remixed these pigments numerous times, so we can be a bit more intuitive with it. And they also don't have to be exact. Different types of branches can be created with various hues. So down here, let's cut through some of these important areas. Trying to find spaces that have a lot of light, because the branches will show through to a much greater degree amongst them as a backdrop. There we go. Definitely starting to look better. Going to try some horizontal ones. Just like that. Want to come back up here. I was just looking at this spot and I was thinking, you know what? What if we had another really big piece that kind of mirrored this one? There we go. Love that. Trying to be extremely cautious and making smaller markings. Being a little bit quiet so that I can concentrate on the movements. I do find it difficult to paint details while talking. At least the details was fine. There we go. Starting to look like an actual forest. Just took time and patience, as well as trust. Oh, I love that one. Very good. I think we could expand on these to a degree. They're nice, but they're a little simplified for what we've been doing. There we go. Just keep expanding till you're happy. If you're not sure when that is, something I like to do when I don't mind spending some real time on a painting is I overdo and then I work it back. That way I've seen it when it has too little, I've seen it when it has too much, and I can find that perfect middle point. But you can only do that if you know what too little and too much looks like. And sometimes it's just not as intuitive of a decision as you want it to be. So in those scenarios, overdo, then repaint. There we go. I think that added a lot to the painting. So now stepping back, really like how it's looking, but again, we have some clutter going on up there. Let's remedy that. I'm actually going to use the liner brush, despite the fact that it's not great with mixing, and I'm going to recreate the color that we used for our sky, which is an abundance of titanium white, the smallest hint of Mars black, and a hint of our ultramarine blue. We don't need a massive amount of paint, which is why we can use this brush. And I'm going to go in to our fairly busy looking top here and reinstigate areas of the sky. Now, what's interesting about this is we're applying a light layer typically over a darker layer, so we don't want to use too much water because we need a very thick application. And we need to make sure that when we do use our water dish is extremely clean. So make sure brush very clean, make sure water very clean, and that will give you a much better result. Otherwise you'll get a muddy green sky color. We've been using a lot of greens. You might even have some brown in there. Not ideal for what we are currently attempting to achieve, right? So do be mindful of that. I'm going to go ahead and remix a bit more because we can't really mix in abundance with this brush, and honestly that's okay. Titanium white though is a very thick pigment, unlike our typical hues. So if we are to go in and cover up previously dark applications, this is truly the best pigment to use heavily in a mix. Just going to keep grabbing, splashing that in. We can do it in the bottom here too. Create a bit of a transition downwards. Typically looks quite nice. Lots of little intuitive taps and decisions. Though this will work best if you decide to do it around areas that already have that light edge, because the light is, again, working around the foliage and brightening it. You can also take out branches if you'd like to. We'll do an example. I didn't actually mind this branch, but it's good to show you the steps, right? There we go. Might need to go back and do a second layer with that because the branch is just so dark, even more so than what else we have on here. And I want to get you a little bit closer for another touch-up we can do. The backing area is not as heavy contrast. It's also quite bright, but it's not really the brightest. And something we can do, granted, it'll be a little bit more tricky at this point because everything started to layer on top of it. We can create a very light green, lighter than what we've used previously, like that. We'll do a little test on foliage in the foreground. We can start applying it to the top and work our way down. And we can apply it slightly into the sky as well so that we have a transition. This is only if you feel the backing isn't really bright enough. At this point, we have too much visually interrupting it to do a glaze. So if we want to brighten it, we essentially do it through the same application pattern that we initially used to create it with a brighter pigment, and we work that pigment down significantly more. Right? We still want that contrast, but we can show a lot more light. And by making this brighter, it makes all of our heavy contrast subjects in the foreground, like our trees, stand out to an even greater degree, helps us build our depth. Again, it's not necessary. It's a little inconvenient. we tried to avoid this, or rather I tried to avoid this, by doing the glaze. But I didn't go as bright as I can tell I now wish I would have. So, many different ways of working around these obstacles later on in the painting process, right? We painted it once, then we fixed it to a point with a glaze, and then here we're doing it again using a tapping technique and a brighter pigment. The taps are going to get more loose and spread out as we get towards the bottom so that we still have that nice contrast. Lots of trees to kind of work in between here. There we go. Nice. Now at this point we have covered all of the canvas, so we're currently looking back on pretty much that which we've done and deciding what we want to do more of, what we want to maybe take away from, similar to what we were just doing. And something I want is a little bit more foliage in this top corner area. Give it a bit more of that vignette effect. I'm going to start with a darker green to a mid-green, and then I'll add my highlights around it. But I'll also make sure that I'm incorporating it in other areas so that if the green is different from my previously applied greens, it still feels nice and cohesive within the painting. So this is a spot really that's going to differ for all of us depending upon what we want to do. But at the end of these, I typically like to give a keyword, something you can use in the comment section to essentially note that you were a part of normally the 13% who actually gets to the end of the video. So if you're here, congratulations. You have a good retention, which is great for learning. And I hope you feel like you learned a lot. But today's keyword will just be light. I feel like we have a lot of light working through this foliage onto the bushes. It's an easy word to work into a sentence, or you can just leave it in the comment section by itself. It's always fun to see who continuously gets the keywords on each lesson. But big thank you to you for just being here, making it this far, being a part of this artistic community. I'm very appreciative of the fact that there's so many people who are here, ready to learn, ready to make something, especially with physical mediums. So big thank you. And also, again, of course, big thank you to everybody up over on Patreon for literally making this lesson and every other lesson happen. Could not do it without you and your support. Thank you for allowing me to teach art for a living in the way that we do. And again, if you're new to the channel, you can find the traceable, so the drawing, to help you. It's grid, it has a grid on it, along with the visual of all of the materials, access to the Facebook group, the ebooks, all of that fun stuff up over on Patreon. And again, it's also just a Great way to support the channel if you can, but if you can't, also absolutely no worries. We have an incredible community who does really help take care of it, and I appreciate that. And we can't always. So, regardless, thank you for being here and being a part of the community. This is another one of those paintings, and I know I say this all the time, I do, where it's just so hard to put down the brush and stop, because we have so many details, and it's just fun. Here, I'm adding back in more light towards the very distant bottom, just building that up over time. I don't ever do a grand amount at once. It's always something where we add some and then we take a break, and we add some and then we take a break. That way we don't overdo it. But the brighter we make this background, the more depth we instill between what we have going on here and what we have going on here. Still using that liner brush, so it's taken a while, but all of our markings can be very intentional. We can balance the painting the way we want. At this point, you really don't want to rush. Put a lot of time and energy into your work, finish it strong, right? Very much feel like we're doing that here. I'm going to create an extra bush, actually, in the distance, so it gets darker, and then it's going to get significantly brighter, and then it'll get darker again as we move down, and it'll dissipate quickly because it's not close to the light. There we go. See that? Nice and subtle. Do you want to keep this dark though? Because I want that to remain quite highlighted, so it almost feels like we have a bit of a path into the painting. And again, just going back up and adding some highlights around the open areas of sky that we reintroduced later on in the painting process. What a pleasure. Thank you for being a part of it. I hope that you feel like you've learned something. I hope you feel excited to go out and create your own piece. I hope that it goes wonderfully. I hope that you have patience through the process and you have faith in yourself, because you can do it. You take the time, you listen, you put in the thought, you can do it. You make something that you love, that you're proud of, you can feel passionate about. Art is such a wonderful thing to make. It's so rewarding. It relaxes you, takes your mind to beautiful destinations. It excites us, does it all. And I hope you have an incredible time with yours. Thank you for spending this time with me, and above all, as always, stay creative.